Hi, and welcome to my OCR A A-Level Biology revision session with me, Christine. So today's lesson, I want to look at population size, which is part of your Module 6 topic area. So you should know about how a growth curve will look in the fact that we have that log, we have your lag, and then we have what's known as the carrying capacity. Now, we have these small fluctuations that are going to happen within a population due to changes in factors such as those food supply. Well, the carrying capacity is the maximum population size that can be supported by a particular environment. So it's important that we remember that these small fluctuations will be where there'll be increases and decreases, and we should see that in any population. Now, environmental resistance is going to increase the death rate and or could decrease the birth rate, and that can be differentiated into a few different things. So if we look at the abiotic environmental resistance, they could be things like temperature, light, pH, availability of water, or soil nutrients. If we look at the biotic factors, then what we're talking about here is either inter-specific competition. Inter means different species, or it could be intra-specific competition, and that's within the same species. It could also be predation. So when we look at abiotic, non-living factors, or if we're looking at biotic, which is living factors, they are going to create this environmental resistance, either increasing that death rate or decreasing the birth rate, and therefore we've reached carrying capacity, which is the maximum population size. So let's look at those biotic factors then. If we're talking about competition, we are talking about animals competing for some form of resource. Now that could be the food source, it could be the territory, it could be for a mate. But if we're looking at this competition, that's going to affect the population size. Now, plants also have competition as a factor in which they are going to be competing, but what are they competing for? And that's where it's things like light. Carbon dioxide concentration is always going to be constant within the environment, so it would be more to do with that light availability or nutrients within the soil or water availability. So do make sure whenever you're talking about these abiotic factors and how they have an effect, and then the biotic factors, that competition is between the living species. So when we talk about plants and we talk about this biotic factor of competition, we're talking about the types of plant species that are going to be competing against each other. So inter-specific competition, for example, my birch trees and my oak trees, they are different species, and therefore that is inter-specific competition. If we're talking about oak trees competing within same species, intra-specific competition. So what you can end up with is different types of forests depending on who is the better competitor. So as we move through, it's important to note that they will potentially give you a graph in the exam that talks about this competition between different species. So the likes of the grey squirrel and the red squirrel. So when we looked at the grey squirrel, it was actually an alien species that was introduced and then outcompeted the native red squirrel. So therefore, if they're showing you a graph and they're asking you to describe the difference between and how the red squirrel has actually died out or become an endangered species, they're looking at you using the data that they have provided in the exam question. So a lot of the questions on population sustainability will be about you applying the knowledge to the situation that they have given you. So one of the key ones that they love to throw at you is a predator-prey relationship graph, where what they are expecting you to do is to look at the information that's been given to you and to then decipher if a conclusion can be made. So when we look at predator-prey relationship, what you should know is that the size of the predator and prey populations are interlinked. like I said before, where we have these fluctuations with the carrying capacity, there's always going to be fluctuations in both your predator and your prey relationship. So as the predator numbers increase, the prey population is going to decrease, and therefore you will see this in the graph that one will increase as the other is decreasing, and then as one decreases, the other will then later on decrease. And the reason being is, if you are a predator and you are going to be needing that food source, that prey, if the numbers become less, you're going to compete within your species. That is going to be intra-specific competition. You will be competing for the prey, therefore there's not enough food source around to sustain the population size. So that will start to result in the population decreasing. Once the predator population decreases, then you have the prey will start to thrive again. So you'll always see these fluctuations, and the fact that they will be interlinked, they'll expect you to describe that if they're giving you a graph. But please be careful when you're given a graph like the one that's on the slide here. You need to describe data points specifically. Don't just state that it's an increase and decrease and there's fluctuations. Give specific points where you can see this. So for example, you've got the Canadian lynx and you've got the snowshoe rabbit here, and you can quite clearly see that they are very much interlinked, and we have those fluctuations. So I looked this morning at 10:55 on the 9th of December 2024 at the world human population. Now obviously I can only give you the number that it was showing at that time point because it's continually changing, it's continually increasing, but the human population is continually growing. So at that point at 10:55 the numbers were 8,192,943,724 humans in the world population. Well, as the human population is growing, that is causing a decrease to the biodiversity, and it's causing this decrease because of a few factors. Now, this is where I'm going to take you back to module 4. So, habitat loss. We are causing deforestation. We are cutting down trees, which are therefore causing these habitats to be lost. That's going to affect the biodiversity within these ecosystems. We have overexploitation, where we have a greater demand for the resources. That's obviously going to have a knock-on effect to the biodiversity. We have urbanization. We need roads so that we can transport these materials in and out and around, and therefore these roads are going to isolate species, so therefore there will be less breeding. We are producing way more population than we should be producing, so that's more waste, fertilizers running off into our water, acid rain because of pollution from the cars, etc. So we are having a massive knock-on effect to the biodiversity, and that is decreasing. We also have an effect on agriculture. So there are large areas of land that are being devoted to farming, such as livestock or monocultures, and these both will lead to a decline in that biodiversity, because if we are obviously ploughing the fields to grow those monocultures or to rear our livestock, we are therefore deflecting the natural succession. We are going to be removing the habitats for those intermediate colonizers, and therefore that is going to have a knock-on effect on that biodiversity. Also, we're using chemicals, pesticides, fertilizers, herbicides, and they are therefore going to have an effect on the species that are present. So these chemicals, these pesticides, are going to be killing the pests. Those pests could be part of a food chain and therefore could affect the available food sources for a secondary consumer. If we have fertilizers, those fertilizers are going to produce more growth of our crops, which are great, but they are therefore going to put more of the different mineral ions into the soil, which could then lead down into the waterworks, and you could have eutrophication. Herbicides to kill a herb, killing plants, we are going to affect the natural succession flow. So therefore, agriculture is having an effect on biodiversity. And also, because we are very particular in what we like to buy as a growing human population, we are losing some of our heritage varieties. For example, our carrots are mainly orange when actually they should be lots of different colours, from yellow to red to purple to orange. So it's important that when you are looking at the effects that we have on biodiversity, that you're thinking about where it all interlinks with your other topic areas. And the other one to look at is climate change. We have changes in temperature and rainfall, which are going to have an effect on biodiversity. So our polar ice caps are melting. Now that's important to note, that those ice caps are the environments that the polar bears need to use, and therefore if they are melting, we're actually having an effect on their habitats. We have rise in sea levels. Now, if you've got a rise in sea level, that's going to reduce the land that is available for the different species. More frequent flooding. We've just had a storm in Cambridge, and therefore we've had an issue of flooding. Now, if our soil becomes flooded, that's therefore going to make it a anaerobic condition, and therefore you are going to have a problem with the availability of the oxygen, and that will have a knock-on effect to the microbes that would be there. So only certain plant species can actually thrive in flooded environments, because if you are changing the environment, you are therefore changing the way the plants can actually absorb the water by the process of osmosis. If there are too many mineral ions there, that's going to have an effect on the way the plant absorbs the water. Also, you've got your modern species not adapting to those changes in the climate. So it's important that we note that the changes in temperature and rainfall are going to have an effect on the biodiversity within those areas. And then also you need to think about migration. We don't have the mosquitoes which cause malaria in the UK. However, as temperatures rise, those mosquitoes could actually, the Anopheles mosquito, could thrive in the UK, and we could have more issues of malaria if we have the vector being present here. So it's important to note these changes in temperature and these changes in rainfall can have a knock-on effect to the distribution of the individuals and also to the biodiversity within the area. So climate change is an interesting one, but it's important to note as we look at this graph here that climate change doesn't necessarily mean that it is the causation of the changes to that biodiversity. So remember, just because there's correlation, that does not mean causation. So if they are going to give you a graph that talks about how climate change can have an effect on the decreasing ecosystems, the decrease in biodiversity, you need to be aware that if it's an evaluate question, you need to have arguments for and against. So therefore, correlation, yes, there are changes to our climates, there are changes to our global temperature, but there are changes over millions of years where we have hotter time periods and we have colder time periods. So it's a case of that we need to be aware that just because these changes are happening doesn't mean that we as humans are having an effect unless they have given us evidence for that. So I hope you've liked this video, and if you have, then please do click on the like button and subscribe to my channel. And if you haven't already done so, please do check out my revision platform, www.aiqchat.com.